All right, we're live. Welcome to Dive into World Building. And today we're going to continue our sort of introductory style topics that we've had for the past 3 weeks. Today's topic is exploring, it's a long one, exploring the implications and impact of your speculative concept. Which is a fancy way of saying, I got this cool idea, now what do I do with it? This was suggested by Che. Yay, Che. So, what exactly are we talking about here? So, what we're talking about is okay, I have a story, and in this world, there's going to be time travel. What does that mean for the way the world works? I have this story, and in this story, there's going to be faster than light travel. What are the implications of that for the way that the universe works, right? Or there's magic in my world, and it has always been around. Always. What are the implications of that for the way the world works? So one of the interesting things about this is that people engage with this question to different degrees. You do not have to know in detail every last little impact that your gadget or MacGuffin or magical power is going to have in this world. You don't. You don't have to have it in order to make the story work well, right? When you look at something like Harry Potter was enormously successful without digging into some of the underlying questions of what the long-term impacts of having magic would be on the real world. But that's okay. On the other hand, I think it's really valuable to be able to sit down and think this through. So, examples. Did you, when you came up with this idea, Che, did you have a concept in mind for an example?
Well, I think some of the things I think about will come from like kind of come from like urban fantasy.
Okay.
Sometimes where it's like, okay, because like kind of like when you approach urban fantasy specifically, I think the first thing that you sort of decide is, well, does everybody know about vampires and werewolves? Is it a secret? Is it a sort of open secret? If it's a secret, how do they stay secret? Because you have to figure that out.
Mm-hmm.
And then if they're out in the open, you need to come up with like socially, what are the parameters that things like werewolves and vampires have to operate under? Are there a separate set of legal implications? You know, are they treated harsher by the law? Are they the law? Are they the rulers? Are they you know, things like that. And so that's kind of one of the things that comes to mind, and it works for everything, but I think it's sort of that initial outset of, let's see, I'm going to put vampires in this idea of mine.
Yeah.
Now, what do I do with it, and how do I do it, and what are the implications?
Sure.
Of having vampires running around.
I'm going to wave a book at the audience. Here's a book that actually deals with those questions really well. I don't know if you guys know this book. It's called Soulless by Gail Carriger. And in this book, werewolves and vampires are part of British society and interact with it in very systematic ways. And it's a super fun series, actually. But obviously there are problems and rules about how they're supposed to interact and social structures that they have. And yeah, it's actually quite well done. The you've got these all these people lining up to volunteer to give blood to the vampires so that they can be eligible to possibly live forever. Right? And it's really, really interesting, and you've got these werewolf clubs, for example, where they've got arrangements. They've all got these sort of squires, I guess you'd say, whose job it is to lock them up on the full moon. Right? But I think it's really interesting. So that is an example of an urban fantasy series that is steampunk. Steampunk urban fantasy, I guess you call it steampunk. I don't know. What do you call it? But anyway, so it's a steampunk thing, but it's got vampires and it's got werewolves, and they're incorporated into society. And it does a really good job of asking how that would work. Right? And these little details, like, the vampires tend to be noblemen because they've just been around so long that they've been able to work their way into having wealth and stuff. So if you had investments, they could just go on forever, right? Yeah. Che, talk about the one that you put in the chat bar.
Okay. Anno Dracula by Kim Newman is probably what I think of as one of the best vampire books ever. And there's a whole series, but I love the first book the most. And it's basically, it takes the idea of Dracula from literature and what if he succeeded in taking over England. And so there are vampires everywhere in England. But it also takes the idea of there being different kinds of vampires with slightly different powers depending on their bloodlines. And the fact that they've sort of the fact that they took over England has changed, I think, in some ways. It changed everything in England, literally. Just about. And the vampires are fairly numerous. There are vampire streetwalkers. There are bars. There is one scene where they go to a bar and there's a live pig that has a tap in its neck that they can turn on a spigot and draw blood from this pig and serve it to vampires. And things like that whole book is full of those sorts of really immersive details.
Yeah.
Of how this thing would work.
Yeah.
And then the vampires are not all super strong. Very young vampires, newly turned, are very weak, very susceptible. Lots and lots of them die young, don't even last a human lifespan.
Yeah, sure.
So it's not like all of a sudden you're a vampire and you're super powered. You're not super powered for another 150 years or something, right? So it's sort of, so he took the time to think about you can't just have everybody be this super powered vampire. You have to negate that on some level. So he put in these limits for the vampires, as well as this is how it works in society. These are the things, there are sort of almost so there's that, and the pig blood and things that were just these really fantastic details built in throughout the book. Just
yeah, so actually I think that you're bringing up something really interesting. And I want to dip back into Harry Potter for a second. I want to draw a distinction, and I think this is an important distinction, between exploring the surface details of the implications and exploring the societal underpinnings of the implications. Okay? Surface details can be done badly.
Oh gosh, yes.
Oh goodness gracious, yes. But let's just take Harry Potter as our example. Earlier I said, well, that Harry Potter didn't really engage with the implications of the magic. Well, it did on the surface details level. So the pop culture of magic was incredibly rich and delightful, right? The newspapers with moving pictures and the paintings and the playing cards and the candy and the, you know, so it's a very rich world in terms of the contemporary implications of what people do. And I do not mean to put that down, because I find Harry Potter delightful, and that's one of the reasons why. But engaging with that and engaging with the underlying issues of how society is structured is a different kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I think it's very difficult, actually, to determine what kind of effects would be had. You know, when you have a particular magic power, it's easy to think that a person who has it might be very powerful and might be more powerful than some other people in the world, right? But I think to take an example of this being done really well, but in an unexpected way, if you look at the 5th season by N.K. Jemisin, what you have is this small group of people who have the power to influence plate tectonics and earthquakes and magma flows and various kinds of things about the earth, but they're actually a persecuted minority. And they're controlled in various ways by social structures surrounding them. So I think that's an example of a story that really engages deeply with this question of how this magic concept would interact with the base social structures of the world that it's set in. I'm sorry if things are a little echoey, Kate. I'm very glad to have you here. It was slightly echoey before you arrived, so it may not be you.
Hi, Kate.
Okay, hi.
The one of the things that you look at is the group that you've introduced, the magicians or the origins. Are they the dominant culture, or are they a dominant social group, or are they not? And that, you know, are they able to operate in the open? What control do they really have? Because, I mean, if you go back to Harry Potter, you know, all you have is the pop culture stuff because they are not operating in the open. So, I mean, if you assume that they're not operating in the open, then you can assume that they're not the dominant group, and that there may not be as many of them as one might think. I'm trying to work backwards from the descriptions that she didn't give, and that's not going to work right now. So. but those are the implications. Is it the dominant group, and isn't? And if so, how does the infrastructure change, the physical infrastructure, as well as the social structures? Because physical infrastructure of a society is affected enormously by the dominant group, regardless of the actual number of people in that group.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting observation, because I don't. It makes me think that taking writing the other was a really good choice.
That's always a really good choice.
Always a good choice.
But what I've noticed, and I'm going to bring this up during my panel on WisCon, is that we have a lot of like TV shows right now where they're kind of showing the sort of like white people being oppressed. And they never go to the token Asian or the token Black person or the token Native American person and say, how did you guys exist under this structure and how can we learn from you? They just go and reinvent the wheel all by themselves. And so I think sometimes it would be really hard for, your basic cis white male hetero, author to go and say, okay, well, how do oppressed people live under oppression? Because how would you know?
Yeah.
I think actually that's sort of what's missing from the whole X-Men thing too.
Yeah.
Because they're mutants, but dear God, it's not like Iron Man is really having trouble with his businesses.
Iron Man's not a mutant.
Okay, well, I'll give you just Robert Downey Jr. then.
Well,
but I think, yeah, there's places to study that and look at how that would really work. Because there's also, when you have a minority that is in power, how much of that actually is out in the open? I look at South Africa and go, yeah, the really overt stuff was really obvious, but there was a whole lot of stuff going on underneath that.
Yeah. Yep.
I remember explaining or trying to, in my very ham-fisted way, about layering in complexity, or at least trying to, and that's what gives more the feel of immersion into your book and authenticity, even though it's a bunch of stuff you made up for the, if that's what you're doing. Like if you're not basing it on something specific and you're just trying to build something from the ground up, layering in complexity is one of the things that will that's like the anti Harry Potter where you are building in tons and tons of complexity, and it does depend. I mean, there's plenty of fantasy that only has maybe like one or two conceits and doesn't explore everything about that.
Yeah.
And is still good and enjoyable. So it depends on how much and how far you really want to dig. But at the same time, some of those enjoyable, lighthearted, shallow books without the layers upon layers of complexity take fire from critics for that very reason. So,
and there's two ends of that spectrum. There's, if you will, Mercedes Lackey, where, the conceits are there and explained. And if I hear the word life bond again, one more time. But then there's Anne Leckie, where it's a lot of it is assumed. She doesn't tell you. And you learn from everybody else's assumptions and the reactions to those assumptions. And I'm starting to think that that's a direction that I want to go in.
Mm-hmm.
Even though I love info dumps. Oh God, I love them. But I don't.
Oh God, I know. Oh, same.
But I don't know that I can rate them.
Okay, so you have this. There's a balance, right, between info dumping and not info dumping. But I think one of the things that Ann Leckie does, which is also what I try to do, is to bring things in when they are at their maximum relevance, and basically put them within the judgment structure of the protagonist.
Yeah.
So that because one of the things that happens when you're dealing with a super complicated world is it feels so complicated, and it feels like you have to understand all the things, right? And it becomes unwieldy and difficult to deal with, right? But if you are able to take that complexity and put it into a single person's comprehension of how the world works, you will simultaneously be able to have large blind spots that mean that you don't have to explain some things, right? A person can be ignorant about large swaths of how their world works.
Yeah.
But you can also explore how the features of the world influence a person's psychology and judgment. And so just by having the character move through the world, you can actually have parts of the world just kind of build themselves. Which I think makes it more manageable for a reader, because we're used to being able to understand one person's perspective on life. And that's one of the reasons why I like to do multiple points of view too.
And that's something that I was going to just say, is that yes, that's useful. Sometimes housing that only in the protagonist kind of sets us up into this colonizer viewpoint.
It can. Sure.
Yeah. And yeah, the different viewpoints coming at it really help to say, you know, it's not just one group saying X and this is how it's all going to work.
Mm-hmm.
It's the interplay between the different, because if you have viewpoint characters from different cultures, and you can explore how those things interact and do or do not work.
You can also do it through interaction, even if you're not in the head of different viewpoints. It's harder though. One of the things that I was noticing as I was recently looking back through Ancillary Justice is that the character of Breck is in a unique position relative to her universe, because she's an oppressed person and also an oppressor. And because she's considered non-human by the people around her, people aren't as careful around her as they might be if they considered her human.
Mm-hmm.
And she also manages to get into situations where people are explaining how they feel pretty openly, right? I think one of the strengths of Ann Leckie's universe is that oppression and basically it's a very intersectional world. Like, there are a lot of different ways in which people can variously oppress each other. And those things can intersect. And when we watch Breck as an outsider coming into it, we get a more complete picture because of that. So she's a really good ambassador for that kind of complexity.
She is. And there are a couple of titles that come to mind. Halfway Human by, I cannot remember who wrote that, but it's someone we all know really well. And then I will post these later. There's a couple of short stories that are really, thank you. You're awesome.
Carolyn Ives Gilman.
Thank you. She's an amazing writer. But yeah, there's that, and then there's a couple shorts that I will later post that just kind of, you know, you can be the insider and the outsider at the same time. Or you can be an outsider in the society and have someone who's even further outside show up. And then this person is trying to mediate between this society they don't feel part of and this other person who has even less information than they do. And so having to act as an intercessory in a way that they've never had to before. They've always been the underdog.
Mm-hmm. That's cool.
So there's
these are situations that actually happen. What were you saying, Cliff?
So there's some examples of world building through this kind of technique. And I'm sorry if someone mentioned them earlier before I was able to join you, but the Hunger Games, one of the wonderful things about that is it's really tightly in Katniss's head. Mm-hmm. And she starts off as, you know, the most underclass of the underclass in District 12. And then of 12, it's like the bottom rung of the society. And then, of course, you know, spoiler alert, she survives book 1 and thus has gained status, right? And is now a celebrity. And yet she has her class. She's never betrays her social class, right? She always is very class conscious. And so in the subsequent book, she has to mediate the use of her own power, which is real but limited, which is mostly the power of celebrity, not actual political power, you know, against the big wheels of political power in both District 13 and the Capitol. But you never see anything outside of her point of view in the whole trilogy. And, what was interesting when they made movies, of course, when you make a movie adaptation, unless you're going to be a very unusual film, but if you want mass appeal, you have to have the film has to be from multiple points of view, right? So when they translated the book into a film, they created scenes like in the control center of the games, for example, that were implied by everything in the book very well. Like every scene that they added felt like it could have been a scene in the book if you had leapt out of Katniss's head.
Yeah.
And so to read the books and then to watch the movies is a really interesting study on how to world build based on single point of view versus multiple points of view. And that, I wanted to throw that out there. And of course, there's, you know, one of the beautiful things about the George R.R. Martin Song of Ice and Fire is the multiple points of view, right? Which now, of course, everyone wants to emulate in epic fantasy because it was so successful. But it was, you know, he put you in the head of good people and bad people and children and nobles and, you know, different characters, and so you see the world through like this multifaceted prism.
Right. So since what we're talking about is implications of a concept, I think that what we've been talking about most recently is implications of a social world concept.
Sure.
I mean, I know that there are quite a lot of concepts that I use in my Varan world, and each one of them has very different implications. One of which, for example, is everybody lives underground and thinks that's normal.
Right.
And that took a surprising amount of work to go through, actually, because we have a tendency to think of our above ground existence as normal, and so there are so many different parameters that potentially have to change if people are living underground and think that's just the way it's done. Because if the surface is not safe, then it reverses all kinds of metaphors and attitudes and descriptors. You know, I mean, one of the easiest things to describe that's different is they don't say out of the blue, they say out of the dark.
Nice.
Right? I mean, but that's a really simple one. Another one that I discovered that when I realized it made sense, but it's totally counterintuitive, is that if someone is on the surface, they're more likely to be frightened in the daytime than in the nighttime. Because in the nighttime, it's almost like there's a roof.
Right.
And they feel like they're maybe underground in the dark and that everything might be okay. when really that's not the most practical approach to actual surface living.
Sure.
Yeah.
Might be somewhat disturbed by the stars that might disrupt that illusion.
Well, yeah, it's true. But what they tend to think is that the stars are like wisps, which is something that exists in their world. There are these, you know, I mean, if you've read anything of mine, you know, there's these little sort of sparkly things, a little bit like these guys.
Wisps. Look out.
I have wisps now.
Cool.
But because
They're worse than tribbles.
because they're not used to looking up much,
Sure.
they look up and they go, well, it's kind of like wisps, and they're able to dismiss it more easily. The other thing that they tend to experience when they go up on the surface is they tend to experience a kind of reversal illusion where they feel like they're going to fall upwards because there's nothing there.
So there's another example of that kind of world building done very well, called Werner Vinge's A Deepness in the Sky.
Yeah.
It's the second book. It's a prequel, but it's the second book in his not known space, what's it called? Zones of Thought series. And he creates an alien civilization based on 10-legged sentient spider-like creatures. And the reality is that their sun dims and brightens, and when it's dim, they have to all go into hibernation, and in order to survive, they have to go deep underground. So underground is safety for them. And the planet is explored by humans during the period where everything is underground, and they see a statue, a sculpture, and it's these giant spiders reaching deep into the ground, and it's mysterious to them, right? Like, why are these spiders, monster things, what are they digging up, whatever. And then you see a subsequent chapter from the spider's point of view. And you find out that the name of the statue is Reaching for a Cord, because it's a peace statue. Instead of reaching up like a human statue would have, like reaching for some kind of a cord with the superpowers, they reach down for the superpowers because that's a metaphor for comfort. And then all through the spider point of view chapters, there's like, they're discussing military operations. They do it in metaphors that make sense to their biology. Like, oh yeah, it's just a lurk and pounce operation, right? You know, that things like that, which he just sprinkles through in, is beautiful world building. And he shows us, by showing us the human side, actually two human civilizations, their points of view, and the spider civilization, you see, including multiple political powers there, you see the world in very different ways when you're, depending on whose point of view you're in. And the reader builds a composite. Now, this is like an 800-page book. So by the time you're done with it, you feel like you've been to a real place. You've gotten all these points of view, and each one of them is in depth, you know, including the bad guys, people who are really awfully human beings. You get chapters in their heads so that they justify their actions to themselves. And you know, everyone's the hero of their own story, and those guys are definitely heroes of their own story. So again, that's Werner Vinge.
I'd like to mention a slightly different story, but one I think is really interesting. And I've mentioned it on the show before. This is The Shifter by Janice Hardy. I was privileged enough to be Janice's friend when she was putting this book together. So I know some things about her process and some things about the way that she improved on the concept and expanded it as she went on. And this was actually really cool because initially, I can't remember which part came first, but you really had two parts to it. One was that the only magic in the world was healing magic. That if you were magical, you could heal people and that was it. Right?
That'd be nice.
That the other concept that she wanted was that magicians would not be waif-like scholars, that they would be buff. And so she put these two things together. And so basically she decided that the magic wielders, some of them were metal workers. So they were smiths, basically. Okay. And that was why they were super buffed. Right. But then you have, well, okay, so are they working magic with the metal? And then how does the healing go into it? Right. So then she decided, actually, what you're doing as a healer is you're pulling somebody's pain out of them as you repair them. And that pain goes into you. Mm-hmm. And then you have to put it somewhere or it will kill you. So what you do is you put it into metal. And then the concept kept expanding. So what, you don't just store it in the metal, you forge it into weapons that can shoot pain at people. Right? And then it became a pain economy. Because what happens is you have the healers who are pulling pain out of people and then putting it into metal, and the metal gets forged into weapons. Well, how do you get more power in the world? You have better weapons. Well, if you go out and you fight and you hurt a bunch of people, then you can pull their pain out and make better weapons. So it's this whole like insidious cycle that depends on conflict and the infliction of pain.
Sounds like late stage capitalism.
That was exactly where I was going.
But you see what I mean? It's awesome. So basically what I loved about this was that she really took her base concept and examined how it would restructure the way people thought in society. And the other thing that she thought about was like, okay, well, so if in fact that the magic that you have is not healing, right, so much as the manipulation of pain, then you might have all these variant types of magic users where it would all be related to the healing process or the pain, but it wouldn't necessarily be the same. So some people can take in pain and they can't put it into metal, but they can heal it themselves without dying. And then there are other people who can there are other people who can take pain out of people and they can't put it into metal. They can put it into other people. That's the protagonist, by the way.
That's nasty. I like that.
It's nasty, and she has a real problem because of it. Because everybody is seeking after her to try to make her into a human weapon, basically. Yeah. So I highly recommend this book. The concepts in it are. Basically it was sold as a middle grade, but the concepts in it are very deep and thorough. and the problems in it are morally quite complicated. So yeah, but it's really neat. And one of the things that I love about being able to talk about it on a show like this is there were lots of different stages in developing the concept, and some of them happened before book 1 came out, and other ones happened when it was like, okay, now book 2 has to come along. How can we push the concept even further? And what happens then, right?
Which cool. Is this?
This is called The Shifter by Janice Hardy.
Ha! That's what I thought. Not that I remembered the title. I remembered her name because you talked about this a while back.
Before, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, like the implications of the technology in Dune, the entire Dune series is based on the spice must flow, right? All the implications, the entire social structure, the technology, all the conflict that occurs in the.
And the only thing about the spice is it keeps you young, right?
Oh no, it powers interstellar flight.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's what it
well, okay,
it also gives you superpowers if you do it the right way.
Okay.
Yeah, they use it to fold space.
Yeah.
And it's like you can't manage an interplanetary empire if you can't get from one place to another anymore.
Okay.
Right. And
so that's kind of why everybody was freaking out. Okay, and like, okay, this comes entirely from like I've only seen the movie and like the miniseries. Okay, so
that's in the book. I mean, that's
okay. I'm like gonna say that. Don't take my word 100% for it because that is where I'm getting my information.
The emperor is the emperor because the emperor controls the flow of the spice, and the Spacers Guild are extremely important because they're the only ones who control interstellar travel. So there's a mutual dependency. The guild requires the emperor to keep the spice flowing to them or they can't fold space. But the emperor can't maintain the empire without the guild because they have a monopoly on interstellar travel.
And all of that depends on the prohibition of machine intelligence.
Yes. Which was the result of a previous conflict called the Butlerian Jihad.
Right, which is where Kevin J. Anderson got into it. But yes.
Yes. Well, we won't go into that. That's a separate.
I'm sorry, I liked those.
Well, no, however you feel about those books, those are separate from, what Frank Herbert was creating, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're building on his creation, but
I just love that idea of because when I read the book the first time, I had no idea what they meant by jihad. Like those were my first Arabic words ever.
That's how I heard the word jihad, right?
Yeah, and why was it the Butlerian jihad? That seemed like a really stupid naming convention until you figured out who Butler was.
Sure.
But to have that all rest on like the lack of capitalism as we know it, but then it shows up in other ways.
Yeah.
And kind of exercises itself in some of those same ways. It's one of the reasons that I keep reading that is because I keep getting more out of it.
It's a great, follow through on the implications of a singular idea. Right?
Likewise, Bujold with the reproductive technology. How many times have you read a story where there is some sort of reproductive technology, but no one takes it further and says, okay, well, how would this change how regular people have babies or whether they do?
Right.
And so in a lot of Bujold, you have that planet where, yes, here are all the rules that are completely different. And it keeps sort of showing up and making the main world seem either weird or uber controlling or wacky or what, but it's the one you're still stuck with as mostly your viewpoint world. And there were points at which I was like, can I just go to that other place and hang out for a while? But you really can't.
Yeah, so I only ever read the first book of Dune, so my perspective on it is a little more limited, which is why I sound like I don't know all the wrinkles.
Yeah.
But still, you can get that from the first book. It could.
Yeah, you can. It's there. It's kind of veiled, but it's there.
Yeah.
Well, so what's nice is when you can expand a concept and keep your consistency, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that requires a lot of work, actually.
Well, and it's hard to go back and write prequels without retconning yourself into several hundred corners.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I would like to hold up Star Trek, which I love and adore, as a negative example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right? The implications of transporter technology are absolutely not followed through. You know, or I mean, if you had that ability, people would start experimenting like how to become immortal, like right away, right? Like
How come they don't get babies out of the replicator?
Right. Yeah. But also, like, if the transporter can make me like get rid of pathologies,
right?
Can it make me younger? Do I have to grow old and die? Right. If I die, can you keep a backup of a pattern buffer and reinstate me? Right?
Yep.
You know, there's no reason why not. That's technological. And if you have a truly interstellar civilization, then there's no reason socially why it wouldn't happen somewhere in the Federation or some other, you know, because everyone has the technology, so some other species might do it, right? You know, and there was that thing in Voyager where this one aliens, they had a phage, you know, an infection that caused organ failure, and they kept stealing organs from people. And I'm like, why can't you just replicate organs? Come on. Yeah. You can do tea hot Earl Grey, but you can't do a spleen.
Well, and I mean, that's also sort of one of the things where it's like where they sort of missed, or it might not have been like at that time, but where there's now talk of 3D printing organs.
Yep. Yes.
So some of them might suffer from when they were made and that the ideas weren't quite there.
Sure. I mean, you know, the time of Enterprise or Discovery or the original series, the technology isn't as advanced. But by the time you're in Next Generation, you know, really?
I meant when the writers were working on.
Oh yeah, sure, right, yeah, in the 1960s.
Yeah, you know, because there's
and at the same time, we see again that all of this really deep underpinning work is not necessary for success.
Right.
No,
that's a very good point.
And like, you know, like I brought up the other day, Harry Potter, you know, works
we spoke about that earlier in the hour, but yes, absolutely.
Precisely because she doesn't follow through is why it is successful, right? Because she wants that familiarity to create the charm.
And some of the things where it's like, if you do skip over going that deep and pinning down everything, it opens the door for those sequels and prequels that you can play fast and looser with.
It does. Although it also tends to highlight where the author wasn't thinking things through.
Yeah,
for the Harry Potter, when she went forward and did, okay, here are the one witchcraft school in the US. And somebody went, wait a minute. Here's the population of the UK. And they have one witchcraft school. Here's the population of the US. They need at least 19.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they would be of all different, you know, ethnicities, because Native Americans would have their own kind of magic and all this other stuff that she just didn't even think about.
Mm-hmm.
Her viewpoint is rather insular, you might say.
You might say that. And making people retroactively gay is not helping.
I think
hashtag retroactively gay is now a thing we should create.
I would support you in that.
Oh my goodness. Well, I feel like there's a lot more here, but we are at the end of the hour. So I'm going to say you guys are awesome. I'm really glad that Kate and Cliff decided that they were going to be here because it's so much more fun with lots of different points of view. That's kind of my general philosophy, actually.
I've kind of noticed.
Yeah. Anyway, I am trying now. So next week might be May 1st, or it might be April 30th. I'm trying to see if I can get Henry Lien to come on the show and talk to us about Pea Sprout Chen, which would be super awesome. So I'm going to cross fingers that I can make that work. And I will update you guys through the Facebook group and hopefully also on Twitter, though I flaked on that this week. And so, yes, hopefully that will be our topic. But if for some reason it doesn't work out, then I will come up with another idea. Anyway, I appreciate you all contributing to the discussion. This is a really fun one. So anyway, I will stop the broadcast.
Thank you for having us.
Oh, thanks to you.